Greetings. Welcome to Dr. English's Book Lovers Book Club. I'm Dr. English and I teach English. This week I am reviewing the classic George Orwell's 1984. After having read all of the modern dystopian novels in the Hunger Games trilogy, I thought it'd be interesting for me to go back and read some of the dystopian literature that came out of the aftermath of World War II. One is not. Brave New World is written before World War II. And so I just wanted to kind of remember. So it's been a while since I read this, probably 30 some years, something like that, I think. And it's amazing to me that what that change in time and what the events that have been happening in the world, change your perspective on what, George Orwell or Eric Blair would have written at the time, right after, a massive war, that involved everybody, and the way that fascism worked, but I thought there were some things about this that reminds me of like any kind of totalitarian government, whether it's on the right or on the left, because there's this whole idea of manipulating people and their psyches, and and the absence of individualism, and definitely the absence of freedom, even the freedom of thought. And that's where, the whole idea of newspeak comes in. Like, there's, no freedom to think. People are conditioned to just believe one thing about Big Brother, and so, and how Winston, goes off and does, whatever he wants, and what he felt like without fear. And so, and the outcome of that is like, Big Brother is watching all the time. And I think there are people now who, talk about like, Big Brother's watching, we have big government, and I'm like, not to the extent that it was in this. Like, everybody was being watched, but yet you never know, like, is it so big that it can't really watch everybody? And in this time, and the way that it's set up, it's not like what we imagine now. Like, it's incredible now when you think about how easily that could happen with the kind of technology that we have. And I've always said, like, if people wanted to find you, they'll find you. They know where you are. I don't know if there's anybody that's completely off the grid, but I just really appreciated it, just being able to go back and read it, and to just notice, the things that, are, he was pretty accurate about. And then there are other things just based on the fact that he wrote it, in the 40s, that he had no concept of what the, modern world was going to look like. Uh, but the idea, the concept is clear as it can be, and how he foresaw that. And I can even remember in 1984 thinking about, are we going to be like that in 1984? And, much to my relief, it wasn't. But I think if he would have put 2024, maybe he might have been a little bit more accurate, but 1984 seemed like a long ways away for him in 1940s. So yeah, I just feel like, he does such a good job of helping all of us to see, what takes place and how it happens. I find that's, more interesting than anything. Because he starts to read, the book. And so that to me is probably the most interesting part of the book, is when it's a book within a book, talking about newspeak, talking about Big Brother, and talking about how society is developed. I just found that really fascinating. Um, and I'm going to read two passages. So I think they really stood out to me, as far as like what happens to people in a totalitarian government, and what happens to language in a totalitarian government. I think those two things are probably the things that strike me right now in our present time in 2026, and what is happening to people and what has happened. There have been other totalitarian regimes since we had Adolf Hitler, and all in other areas of the world. I think of the Khmer Rouge. I think of the things that happened in South Africa and the African continent with Rwanda, I think it is. But there have just been brutal dictators, since World War II. And of course, we have all the things that happened in the Soviet Union with Stalin. And so, we are not like clueless to what it looks like. I guess that's the other thing I think that sometimes we just need to be reminded and be aware of the warning signs. This is about uh, what happens to people, and I felt this was really important to read out loud. 3 months later, FFCC, which is the floating fortress, had suddenly been dissolved with no reasons given. One could assume that Withers and his associates were now in disgrace, but there had been a report of the matter in the press or on the telescreen. There had been no report of the matter in the press or on the telescreen. That was to be expected since it was unusual for political offenders to be put on trial or even publicly denounced. The great purges involving thousands of people, with public trials of traitors and thought criminals who made abject confession of their crimes and were afterwards executed, were special showpieces not occurring oftener than once in a couple of years. More commonly, people who had incurred the displeasure of the party simply disappeared, and they were never heard of again. One never had the smallest clue as to what had happened to them. In some cases, they might not even be dead. Perhaps 30 people personally known to Winston, not counting his parents, had disappeared at one time or another. And then the other piece that I wanted to read was about language and their newspeak. And it's really just the dismantling of language and the interpretation of language that happens. And I thought I have a note to myself, and this was from 40 years ago that I wrote a note and underlined this, and I thought it made sense to me to read this since it really struck me. Don't you see the whole aim of newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed by exactly one word, which, with its meaning rigidly defined and all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten. Already, in the 11th edition, we're not far from that point. But the process will still be continuing long after you and I are dead. Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. Even now, of course, there's no reason or excuse for committing thought crime. It's merely a question of self-discipline, reality control. But in the end, there won't be any need for that. The revolution will be complete when the language is perfect. Newspeak is Ingsoc, and Ingsoc is Newspeak, he added with a sort of mystical satisfaction. Has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050, at the very latest, not a single human being will be alive who could understand such a conversation as we are having now? Except, began Winston doubtfully, and then stopped. So I do feel like I think even now, it's just from reading young adult novels to reading 1984, I had to slow down to read. And I feel like even in 30 years time, I have read lots of dense material, but I see that people's ability to read dense material or complicated material seems to lessen because of where our literacy is at. And there are plenty of other teachers, beyond me, that see those needs for, developing, our literacy in complex ways, because literacy, language is complex. And then you throw in that there are so many different languages. There those nuances. That's why I became an English teacher. I love the nuances of language and the meanings that we get when we read all kinds of texts and in all kinds of modalities. I find that really just fascinating. What an incredible thing language is when you stop and think about it, and its connection to our consciousness. Like, it's like Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." There's another person who also had a play on that, and he said, "I speak, therefore I am." And I think there's something to be said about that. Like, you have thought, but the consciousness is there because you're able to speak and share language with others. So for me, 1984 has always been a book about not just the totalitarianism, but also about how we use language. And I'm sure Orwell probably understood that better than anybody since he was such a gifted writer. So now, would I teach this in high school? Well, it's, some people are bringing this back. I've noticed that. I've noticed that people are doing online book clubs of sharing 1984 once again. And so I think Animal Farm is probably more often taught in high schools. It's a little bit shorter. But I still think 1984 is the best one by George Orwell. The one that, maybe is a little more complicated, but it explores um, that idea of people just disappear and language disappears. And I find that really fascinating, and want to fight against that with everything, in every part of my being, because of my love of language in particular. So yeah, this is a book that has been taught. I think it will continue to be taught. I think that, this is, not like a young adult novel, but in a way, it should, young adults are the people that need to be aware of what was going on in the world post World War II. Um, and this is a good book to help us think about what kind of things happen in that kind of governmental form, and to guard against it. That's part of what we should be doing as a democracy and a constitutional republic. And I think if we don't do that, we've lost our way. So, yeah, I recommend, that if you have read it many years ago, I'd say, go back and read it and become familiar and be reminded of the things that George Orwell left behind for us to be aware of and to be cautious about, and to stay alert at all times about what we hold true in good in our lives, and our freedom to read what we want, to say what we want. That's an incredible gift. So thank you for joining me. I'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.